This is the Farming for a Better Climate podcast. Hello and welcome to this Farming for a Better Climate podcast. My name is Seamus Murphy and today I'm joined again by Robert Ramsay. How are things, Robert?
Things are good, Seamus. It's good to be back on this and pretty busy out there. There's a lot happening, some really good, some not so good, but certainly plenty of work for an agricultural consultant at the moment.
Good stuff. Last time we chatted, we were talking about carbon markets and a bit about carbon audits. One of the kind of big talking points at the moment is around energy and particularly our reliance on kind of natural gas and fossil fuels essentially, and how the energy crisis that we're kind of in at the moment has brought back to the fore possibly our need to be kind of more resilient in that area. And that has led some people to look at kind of how can we increase our fossil fuel to give ourselves a bit of more of a buffer against global prices, we'll say. But I think most kind of logical thought has said, right, we probably need to look more at renewables to really insulate ourselves from the global kind of energy markets. What's the kind of impact that the energy crisis is having on agriculture that you're seeing?
It's massive. It really is. Probably our number one concern at the moment is, the energy thing. We're so exposed to just geopolitics, isn't it? We've got we can see the reasons why there's a spike in energy cost, but as farmers and producers, we're so limited to what we can actually do with, other than going and producing more. Renewables, there's a lot of options there, but with regards to, if you're a dairy farmer, there's only so much you can drive efficiency in your system. There's only so low you can, you've got that heavy load from a parlour and from pumping and cooling, and you're a big energy consumer. And if that energy cost of electricity goes from 12 or 14 pence up to, in some cases, 80 pence a unit, your accounts are going to look very different this year. For the most part, in my part of the world anyway, the dairy guys are a bit insulated from it in that they're getting a really good farm gate price for their product. But if you go into the tatty country, the veg country, and look at those producers who are even more exposed to cooling costs, that story's maybe not just so bright either. And what I think we are becoming aware of, but I think our consumer is blissfully unaware of, is this issue is here and it is massive, and it's going to have long-standing impacts on farmers and, more importantly, on consumers and inflation.
If it is something that is kind of a longer-term problem, it will start eating more and more into those profits.
It's worth saying that most of the guys we're dealing with are aware this is probably a fairly short-term blip. We would expect energy costs to be reducing in certainly the coming months, hopefully months, but definitely years. But what this has highlighted is how exposed we are. And we know if we're working with finite resources, it's going to happen again. And, the human race is struggling for resources, and the more the more we can do on farm to improve resilience, to reduce demand and increase supply, the more we can do to actually future-proof our business. And if we don't do anything, we're super exposed to whatever the next energy crisis is or the next big issue is going to be.
Well, that kind of highlights what we're wanting to talk about today in terms of how can we, or what is the benefit of on-farm renewables. And to help us kind of unpack all of that, we have environmental consultant Iain Boyd here. And Iain has worked on a lot of renewable projects, small-scale renewable projects on farms in the past. Welcome, Iain.
Thank you for having me.
Would you like to introduce yourself?
Yeah, so I work in the environment team of SAC Consulting. When I first started here, about 8 years ago, I was pretty much entirely focused on renewables. At the time, there was a big demand for kind of small and medium scale farm projects, and that was mostly driven by things like the feed-in tariff, which was offering a really good payback and rate of return on various kind of wind or hydro or solar projects. That, as subsidies decreased, as that went away, the demand for renewables on kind of farms or small, medium scale anyway, definitely decreased. And then recently there has been that kind of renewal in it again, and a lot more kind of inquiries and people suddenly looking at their bills or looking at their options just to see what they can do, either to offset their bills or to generate kind of an additional source of income. So yeah, recently there's been a bit of an increase, but generally speaking, in my job, I do a lot of environmental assessments, a lot of development work, a lot of planning applications and that sort of thing.
Cool. And then in terms of the actual the wider energy system, we'll say, and the kind of cause of this energy crisis, could you give us a bit of a breakdown as to how it all works and the reason for the crisis we're currently in?
Yeah, there's a very big, complicated question. You said something in your intro there about how people were saying about we should increase our own production of fossil fuels as one possible way of combating this. So the majority of our natural gas, for example, does come from the North Sea, whether that's from ourselves or Norway. So it's already pretty local to us. We have a big offshore oil and gas industry already. The rest of it tends to come from places like Qatar or the Middle East, USA, a little bit of Russia, but not actually that much of Russia. People do wonder, why are you paying more on your bills if we're constantly talking about how good renewables are? We're constantly increasing the amount of renewable output we have, the amount of our power and general demand that comes from renewables. So people are a bit confused as well. If this has all been driven by kind of oil and gas prices, why am I paying more? The really basic and simple answer is that the system is really outdated. The energy system, the whole way you pay for stuff, it's all based on what it's been for hundreds of years. It's been based on fossil fuels. It's been based on coal, oil, gas, and that's kind of how you work out the price for things. And it's a global issue. And when you have things like changes in demand, the price goes up. So there's been a bit of a storm of a few different things, whether it's coming out with COVID. So suddenly everyone's starting to do more stuff. Energy demands are increasing. You got more use for things like transport, just generally kind of going into work and things. Production's gone up again. Then you've also had the Ukraine war, which has kind of caused issues with Russia. It doesn't affect us too much. I think the UK Parliament did a thing where only about 4% of our gas in the UK comes from Russia. So we're not overly reliant on it from gas point of view. Same for oil, it's quite a low percentage. But it's this global commodity, it's a global market. So any kind of issues or problems or concerns worldwide, it will impact it, and therefore you have these knock-on effects. The important thing is that it's not just us that's experiencing this. It's happening worldwide right now.
It's probably one of those things that farmers are probably in a better position to understand that, with kind of the commodity market in terms of wheat and all these kind of things, where the general public might find that kind of a bit confusing because it doesn't really affect them regularly when global things kind of hit their pocket, whereas with farmers that's probably something they're quite used to.
So I think they understand the system pretty well. As you say, they're used to it. What they don't maybe understand is why. They understand the impact of global markets, but why have we offshored our energy and food supplies? The global market, the free market economist story is probably up for question at the moment as to how exposed we are. I actually landed up. So when I'm at home, I am a farmer. So I'm not a politically correct agricultural consultant. I've got my own views when I'm at home, and I found myself watching Question Time nodding when Piers Morgan was talking, because he basically was talking about what a developed economy in the world would actively offshore their food production and their energy production.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody was clapping, and he said, "It's actually, we don't just think it's us; it's all of them. It's where developed economies have landed up, and we're almost at a point where I think we're seeing a massive change in economic policy, or potentially to see that after this, it's such a big impact. Is we need to fling the old system in the bin and re-establish a system that's maybe got us nearer the foreground."
Mm-hmm. It could be a couple of years before we see that kind of shift, I would say.
A couple of years might be optimistic.
They talk about this thing, and well, it probably applies to many sectors, but in the energy sector, they call it the energy trilemma, which is where you try and balance like your security of supply, your costs of energy should be affordable for everyone, and the environmental impacts of that energy. And they're trying to it's a constant struggle to try and get an equal balance between those three things. And what we've seen recently is that it's gone to whack, and it's definitely not affordable for people, and there's security issues, and as a result you're getting environmental issues as well. So it's kind of all not working the way it should be at the moment.
And what is the current mix then of the UK grid, we'll say? What kind of percentage are we talking, renewables versus fossil fuels?
Yeah, okay, so there's a couple of things to think about here. We've been talking a little bit about energy, and we've been talking a bit about like electricity, which generally speaking is what you get from most renewable developments. And there are different, so electricity is a component of energy. So generally speaking, our energy consumption, a lot of that goes in things like heat. Obviously, we're quite a cold country. You have to have a big heating demand. A lot of it goes in transport, and about a quarter, a fifth of it is kind of electricity consumption. Generally speaking, global kind of energy demand is still very reliant on fossil fuels. When you think about that in terms of like freight transport, flying around the world, our reliance on natural gas and boilers and things like that in your home. If you look specifically at UK electricity generation, over the years you've actually seen a really massive and steady transition away from fossil fuels to renewables. So if you go back to 2013, 36% of UK's electricity generation came from coal. And in 2021, it was 2.1%. So there's been a massive shift from that. And at the same time, you've seen an increase in renewables. So renewables in 2013 was just under 15%. It's now around about 40% of our electricity mix. Now, there's been some slight caveats to that. Obviously, we've had COVID, it was a bit of a strange year. During 2020, the weather conditions were incredible for renewable generation, which meant that year there was record levels. Renewable resources completely outstripped your natural gas and your coal and your fossil fuels for the first time ever. They were dominant of it. Last year, you had the kind of reverse problem. If you think back to it, there was periods of really calm, still weather. There was periods when it wasn't really that sunny at all. So things like wind power wasn't working as well as it has in the past. So I actually seen a little slight dip in renewable generation. So the key thing to take away is that it's a bit complicated. It depends on a mix of things, but it's increased over the years. It's continuing to increase. And there is goals in the UK and Scotland to have, 100% of your electricity needs from renewable sources. And they are, we are getting there. But you do need this kind of healthy mix of different energy sources on the network just to ensure the security of supply, whether that is renewables, nuclear, depending on what your views are of it, phasing out fossil fuels. It all plays a part. I was trying to get a balance right.
Yeah, and predominantly at the moment, the renewables in the UK would be wind. Is that true?
Yeah. So definitely, if you think in Scotland, so specifically for Scotland, the installed capacity is overwhelmingly onshore wind at the moment.
Okay.
So there's about, Scottish Renewables have some good stats. Of a total of 13,302 megawatts installed, 8,780 is onshore wind. It used to be, after that, it was hydro. There's some really big hydropower plants in Scotland.
Mm-hmm.
That has changed recently in that it's now offshore wind, which is the second most dominant. So you're seeing an awful lot of these large, really large offshore wind farms appearing up off the east coast of Scotland, for example. And that, these are really huge turbines able to generate a lot of power out at sea, so you can scale them as substantially bigger than onshore. So yeah, generally speaking, it's wind by quite a bit. Then you have hydro, then you have other things like your solar, PV, bioenergy, things like wave and tidal, really small percentage of it. It's not really taken off yet.
Yeah. And then in your experience, what kind of small scale projects were common in the past, and then what are the kind of queries you're getting now? Because I personally, I've heard a lot more people talking about solar.
So in the past, the kind of types of technology and the scale of technology that was installed for the small, medium scale now, so utility scale and things like that, it was a bit different. But if you think about the small, medium scale a lot of people were putting in, it was very much driven by what were the incentive payments, what was the best scale and best kind of type of technology that's going to give me back the best return on my investment. So you actually saw sometimes wind turbines and things like that being curtailed to a certain output because it gave them a slightly higher tariff band in the feed-in tariffs and things. But the types of technology haven't overly changed from then to now. So things like your small scale wind, your small run-of-river hydro schemes, solar panels, whether that is roof-mounted or ground-mounted, AD plants, biomass plants, heat pumps, whether it's water source, air source, ground source. So it's the same kind of technologies that were being installed 10, 15 years ago that people are still starting to look at, still looking at and still thinking of installing. The main difference, I would say, is that the cost of the renewable technologies has come down drastically, and now it's cheaper than many fossil fuels in most cases. So last year, of the total power generation added last year, about 2/3 of it was cheaper than the cheapest fossil fuel option. So you've seen a really quick reduction in the cost of these things. And that is kind of one of the main reasons they took away the incentives. The incentives are just there to help the technology get established. And then once it gets established, it should be able to kind of stand on its own 2 feet. Arguably, you could say that they took it away quite quick. There wasn't much notice given when they were removing some of these subsidies. But now it does pay for itself. And if you have the right kind of type or scale of development, if you have the right types of use, if it's a well thought out project, they do pay for themselves.
It's amazing how much it has changed. So when those incentives were pulled, we were fairly well of the opinion that the market, the theory was the market would step in and viable projects would go forward and ones that didn't pay wouldn't. And we kind of had the view that would never actually happen. It was like the death of the renewable industry, and you saw a lot of pretty strong headlines about it. But you look at it now and it's absolutely market driven. And from where probably under the feed-in tariff scheme farmers were looking at it and probably, very focused on subsidy income, they're now so if you could argue, the subsidy junkie word was used in the past, we're now very much efficiency driven, where the right scheme does get built in the right place. So we've a heap of people now. I don't think there's a day goes past in here where people don't phone about solar or options. Solar being the easiest one, quickest one, and probably cheapest one for a lot of guys who've got big shed roofs or options to install these systems pretty cheaply. And at a time, I was on one farm where they were looking at spending $250,000 on solar panels, and I was thinking that's quite stuffy, but their new electricity bill was going to be $350,000 a year. Mm-hmm. So if we, these systems are really coming to life, and it's quite an exciting time again for renewables, isn't it?
Yeah, and you absolutely nailed the point there that this period of really high investments, they were great, and there's a reason they were there, but the feasibility of schemes was based on the amount of feed-in tariffs or RHI or ROCs they could generate. It wasn't really on the value of that energy itself, and it really did start things, whereas now you're seeing it go the other way, which is arguably better, and it's the way it's going to last into the future, is that people are actually really getting the benefit of what they're generating, and they're using it on site or exporting to the grid or whatever. But that's kind of the real value of it these days, is the energy that's actually being produced.
Yeah, and presumably the guys who did get in when the incentives were there are in a great position now.
It is interesting. I've one client who's in the position Ian was talking about. Is he's got a big turbine that's capped, so it's a 750 kilowatt turbine that's capped at 500. Mm-hmm. And you look at the opportunity of those extra 250 kilowatts. There's he's certainly winning. The job's going well, but there is potential lost income in there, and it's pretty significant at the moment. But as you say, on the whole, the guys who are in, what a tremendous hats off to them for doing what they did. They're reaping what they sowed.
In general, on farms, where there are kind of these high energy demands, we probably should try and reduce our energy use before, because not everyone is going to have the opportunity to get kind of wind turbines on board or solar panels or these kind of things, and particularly in the current high prices that we're dealing with right now, a lot of the investment that is happening right now isn't going to help in the short term. So do you have any advice for some of these farmers that might have really, really high energy bills at the moment, and how that they could reduce their energy use, reduce their electricity need?
Yeah, the first thing you should always do, no matter what, before you invest in any types of renewable generation or storage or anything like that, is you should always look at improving efficiency. Now, there's a few reasons for that. It kind of means that you're actually investing in, when you choose whatever type of technology, you're investing in the right type of technology, the right scale of technology, the right scale of storage. You're not going to be paying for something actually you maybe don't need if you did some things just to improve what you're currently doing on farm. The basic way to do it is to do like an energy audit, monitor your bills, see if your bills have gone up over recent years, see what activities have caused that, see if there's anything you can reduce, or if you can get more efficient technology or equipment in place. Allowing all that to be done, actually, in the long run, if you are going to invest in renewables or something, it will help you get a higher proportion of the on-site demand met by whatever the renewable tech you're thinking of putting in. Or vice versa, you're going to have more you're able to export onto the grid and then get paid for that as well. So ideally, try to make any efficiency improvements you can. A lot of kind of common sense management stuff on farm, just kind of stuff you would do anyway as part of your day-to-day running for it. Just do that and try and make these savings. See if you can make best use of your existing grid connection. Grid connection is one of the sometimes most costly parts. Are you using your grid connection fully? Is there anything you can do there? Even things like getting your voltage right on farm, so clever kind of electronics and engineering solutions there. All these little efficiencies you can do all add up, and it means that yes, you're going to save money on your bills. It also means if you do decide to go and install some form of generation, you're installing the right type.
Mm-hmm. And I assume that a carbon audit is possibly something that it could be a good thing to do to indicate your energy usage and where kind of you might have high energy usage in areas to focus on.
When I said energy audit, really energy carbon audit, one of the main things for renewables is that they should be green, they should be energy efficient. They are a sustainable form of generation. So yeah, as well as kind of the financial and economic savings you might get, there's like huge potential there for like reducing greenhouse gas emissions and some kind of environmental improvement to your business.
The beauty for that, the carbon audit's probably quite a blunt tool for it'll highlight where you're high or low, but it's an excellent benchmarking opportunity against peers. So we've got a good pool of validated carbon audits, which basically we compare every time we do another audit. They're all compared to each other. So we look at where you're high and low versus your peers in the same with the same enterprise. So if you do your carbon audit and something comes out really high, obviously high, there's a need to go and dive in and see. And it's interesting going back to the feed-in tariff story. In the past, those renewables, so even those people who've invested heavily in renewables in the past, they were rewarded for production of kilowatts. So their payback period was based on how much they could produce. For the new guys, the new system basically it's on savings. So there's no incentive other than what you save. Don't produce or don't use anything that we don't need to use. There's no incentive there whatsoever. And the more we can save on farm, the more you get to sell to the grid as well. So there's an interesting story in that one. But I'm just thinking back as well to, I facilitated the Woodhead Climate Change Focus Farm in, I think it was between 2015 and 17. And in 2016, the dairy prices were really in a bad place, and dairy farmers were in a bad place. It was actually pretty difficult to get people enthusiastic enough to attend meetings, and the most of them went well. The one we really struggled with, we've got 4 attended a meeting on saving energy on the dairy farm. And what I'm looking at now is, or what I'm thinking now is that we were dead right. We were just 5 years too early. And I know if we had that meeting today, we've got a few actually planned in the pipeline, but if we had that meeting today, it would be standing room only. It's a major thing. And finding those inefficiencies, it's really pretty rewarding. If you can find something that doesn't cost you much and can save you considerable amounts of money, particularly when it comes to cooling, adding a second-hand plate cooler alongside the one you've got, pumping cold water through your plate cooler, reusing hot water for other jobs. There's a whole load of stuff we can do that has a significant saving and doesn't cost a lot of money. So there's low-hanging fruit in this world, and there's certainly plenty of people. There's good resources on the Farming for a Better Climate website from previous work we did. Probably now I'm sure the price per kilowatt hours and things will not be quite accurate, but the technical story behind it all is all there, and the resources are there and free to be used and should be useful.
Mm-hmm. And in fact, all those kind of practical guides and stuff that are on the Farming for a Better Climate website, they are currently being updated. So within the next month or so, there should be some really up-to-date and new resources put online as well.
And in terms of the incentives, I know we kind of hinted that there are not many incentives for the kind of installation of these kind of things, but is there any funding available or any incentives for an energy audit or feasibility studies or any of that kind of thing, or has it all dried up?
Well, just going back to a couple of things actually that Robert mentioned, which are quite interesting. So yeah, incentives have mostly kind of gone away, but that's kind of led to opportunities for new things. So the export part of the feed-in tariff used to have 2 parts, which was like a generation tariff and an export tariff. The export tariff has been replaced by something called Smart Export Guarantee, which basically ensures you're paid for something that you generate you're paid something for what you're putting onto the grid. So that is there. They just, in the past, it hasn't been quite as high as it was for feed-in tariffs. But with the kind of energy crisis and the increased kind of bills, that's kind of had another effect where that the demand for renewables, the demand for energy has soared. So actually what people are willing to pay, what generators are willing to pay for that generation has spiked, and it really spiked during the summer. So things like power purchase agreements, which is essentially like an agreement between you and a supplier that they're going to buy your electricity, they were sky high during the summer, almost comparable to what some of the old feed-in tariffs used to be. So there is some kind of good deals, and it very much depends on your site, the scale of development. There's sometimes a lot of kind of caveats and things like that you have to look into. But there is some good deals out there. So I would recommend you kind of shop around, first of all, for your kind of export kind of tariff or any kind of power purchase agreements you can get. The second thing would be there is kind of some form of funding available in terms of Business Energy Scotland. They do offer kind of loans to small and medium enterprises, which are favourable rates to look into kind of these sort of things. Banks offer really favourable rates on renewable or kind of green environmental projects. So it's worth speaking to your bank or a few other banks if you do need any kind of funding there to kind of help develop these things. But I mean, the main driver right now is like making the best use of that generation and offsetting your bills, and it will help pay for itself, especially if you factor in the lower cost of the tech. And if you can get a really simple development, something like solar panels, for example, which Robert mentioned earlier. Solar panels, generally speaking, if they're on a roof of a shed, if it's a structurally sound south-facing roof, generally speaking, that's classed as a permitted development, so you don't have to go through the whole planning process for that. Things like wind turbines and that, they would need full kind of planning application. But it's always worth double checking, because there's some cases where that's not the case. But it can be quite a simple, straightforward thing to install, and it can help offset your bills, especially if you have a demand that relates really well to it, and you can get paid for anything you export at the same time. So it's worth looking at.
I would also highlight you mentioned Business Energy Scotland. There's also Home Energy Scotland too. So in a lot of cases, the places that maybe not in the dairy and the cold store scenarios, but in normal beef and sheep farms, one of the biggest concerns is actually heating and lighting what's often a cold, drafty farmhouse. So there is good funding available out there, or again, it's interest-free loans and funding packages available for insulation, heat pumps, all manner of technologies to help make improvements. So if that's the driver, certainly Home Energy Scotland is the place to go. And really just to highlight as well that talking about this stuff's the most important. If you ask the question to enough people, you're going to get an answer. So there's us, there's Farm Advisory Service, there's the Energy Agency are very good when it comes to this stuff, and even many of the installers of these things, the solar guys. If you've got good guys that have been at this for a long time, have the conversation and see how these systems actually fit into your or might fit into your business at home.
What is the payback on these systems now?
So I do get asked this a lot. It is very site specific. So if it relies on what's your potential yield going to be. So for example, if you're putting up a wind turbine, what's your wind speed? And then you have to think of stuff like, well, where's the grid in relation to my turbine? The grid is sometimes will kill a project depending on what you're wanting to use the energy for. But generally speaking, you would like a grid connection, because for the times you can't use it on farm, if you can export it, at least you're still getting paid something for it. And the way the grid was set up in the past is it was very much set up for having a big power station next to a large city. Now, generally speaking, the places that are best for renewables tend to be pretty remote, tend to be on islands or up hills and that sort of thing. So there's a lot of work going on with the various kind of grid operators to try and free up capacity and allow kind of renewable connection to take place. And there's a lot of kind of clever stuff that they're doing there. So it's worth looking at that. And then it's kind of also, you have to think about, well, what's the construction costs? Things like steel and cement at the moment, the cost of those are very high. But also like labour, can you do some of the work yourself? Do you have the ability and the skills to do some of that? And then if you do need plan permission, if you're going for kind of a larger scale development or something that's not a permitted development, there can be costs associated with that in terms of environmental assessments, site design, all that sort of stuff. So it's not a simple answer in terms of working out the payback, but it's something you really need to do. You have to really look at what are the costs going to be for me? How can I simplify it? And then also what we've just been talking about, what are the potential income options for me? Is it offsetting? Is it kind of getting paid for exporting? And yeah, as we said, look around, have those conversations and try and find like the best options that will help you pay these things back much quicker.
I've seen quite a few cash flows by, basically, I suppose, sales, particularly solar salesmen who, they've done reasonable cash flows and their assumptions are based on current energy prices. And I really hope when you see it like that, the payback period's generally pretty good if you're a significant user. But I really hope for for all those people out there who can't install renewables, for the general public, I hope the payback on a lot of these systems is actually longer than they appear to be in paper, because the electricity price, the energy price, actually sorts itself out down the line, and what we're actually saving is actually a bit less. But in the long run, there's no doubt having some control over the energy you're producing on farm, or the energy you're using on farm, has to put you in a better place, regardless of what the payback period is.
I actually had that very discussion with a solar installer a wee while ago, asking about these really quite optimistic payback periods, and he was saying, well, actually all you only need these really high prices to be here for a couple of years, and you've kind of paid it off then. If it goes back down after that, that's okay, because you've already managed to offset and generate enough other income in that period. So it kind of depends on your timing. It kind of depends on your deal and various things. But no, you're right. I think for any of these things, they're going to be in the ground for 20, 25 plus years. So it's a long-term thing you're thinking about. And it is sometimes, depending on the scale of it, it would be a change of land use from agriculture to energy in some cases, like, for example, for a large ground-mounted solar farm. So you have to think about that things. There's other implications in terms of like your kind of long-term business plan, your succession planning, that sort of stuff, because they are here for decades.
And there is another kind of element to that, where if we think about it, we're kind of assuming that there will be a grid connection, or we can connect to the grid, but there are kind of opportunities for farms that maybe are currently off grid, or farms that won't be able to get that grid connection, and there's different ways where storage of energy when it's not being used could be factored in, particularly in terms of batteries. I know that batteries are improving an awful lot in the technology that's there, but also kind of an area that it comes into the spotlight is hydrogen. I think the last time I heard about it, there was talk of on-farm hydrogen generation to fuel tractors and farm equipment. What's the kind of update on hydrogen?
Yeah, that's a good question. So hydrogen, as well as batteries, which you touched on there, they're kind of constantly mentioned, and constantly people are looking at them as this maybe next big thing, and they are there, like you say, they are developing the whole time. Wouldn't say it's definitely not widespread yet. The benefits of hydrogen, for example, hydrogen from renewables, so-called green hydrogen, you can produce it by something called electrolysis, which is essentially you're putting electric current into water, and you separate out your hydrogen and your oxygen, and the hydrogen can then be, used as a gas at a later point. The advantages of it are kind of what you said. If, for example, you don't have that demand for it on farm for the electricity, you can use it to generate hydrogen, and you can store that, and then you can turn it back into electricity at a later point in a fuel cell, or you can burn it in an engine as well. Or you can also, like people are looking at, injecting it into the grid. You do have hydrogen vehicles, you do have hydrogen tractors, you have kind of bits of equipment and stuff that do work on hydrogen. It was kind of generally used as like for more of the kind of larger scale transport options, really. So like things like buses, ferries, tractors, because kind of batteries themselves are very heavy. You need quite a lot of batteries to move something that's kind of on the large scale transport wise. Batteries are improving the whole time, and I'd say a lot of the kind of attention at the moment is generally going into kind of battery tech. Now, hydrogen is still there. Hydrogen is an option for a lot of people. There has been a few videos and a few studies done. I think there are some videos on the Farmer for Better Climate website looking at kind of some of the work that some farmers are doing up in Aberdeenshire, which is quite an interesting thing to go look at. So it's there, and it is an option. It's one of these things, I think, keep an eye on it for the future. There's quite a few interesting policy things happening soon, which will have effects on things like this. So Scotland's going to phase out new petrol and diesel cars by 2032. So that's going to have a massive implication on things like, well, what you're going to power them with. Is it going to be hydrogen? Is it going to be batteries? Same for gas boilers. Gas boilers in houses are getting phased out for kind of all new developments in the next few years. So yeah, it's one of these things just to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
I think the thing at the farming end is most of what we are doing is heavy. So it's, as you say, it's large vehicles, tractors, even pickups, towing trailers, combines. All these things are, to my mind, too heavy to be electric, too big to be electric, too much load on them to be electric. And you look at, I see JCB is doing a lot of work with hydrogen, and certainly they're backing that into the future. I mean, you see big companies like that coming into it. I think the hydrogen world will have to get in gear in the next wee while and become more relevant. I think the one area, just you mentioned it a bit, Iain, is the hydrolyzer. So the adding hydrogen to a diesel engine. So David Barron's done a big advocate for it. And actually just injecting hydrogen into the fuel, the air intake of a normal diesel engine makes a cleaner burn and a much more efficient, you get a lot more miles per gallon on your diesel car, and you get a much cleaner engine when you're servicing it too. So there's something in there as well. And in the interim, while we are still on diesel, there's a role for hydrogen in there. To make us a bit better, and it's a nice cheap solution that seems to work. Anybody who's doing it seems to work really pretty well.
These are obviously future kind of plans, but it is coming down the line, and it is, as you said, with JCB doing a lot of work. It's something that farmers should be aware of, and I suppose perhaps it is an opportunity for some of these farmers that are looking at taking advantage of renewable energy at the moment. Possibly too expensive to get that grid connection.
Yeah, so I think it's pretty funny how change, it's not always new. The adding hydrogen to hydrogen production to renewables is basically there because we can't guarantee how much production we're going to get from. If we get a windy day, we get a lot of electricity. If we get a still day, we don't get much. So it's how do we actually store that electricity? And it's almost the opposite, but the end result's the same of what the nuclear power stations back in the day. They had a very level profile of production, so we got loads of electricity, and there was periods of the day we didn't need it. So overnight, that's where the pump storage hydro systems came from. So we were pumping water up hills to make use of cheap electricity and then flow it back down the hill to create electricity at the dearer time of the day. So it's almost like the opposite reason, but it's the same end result. We need some way to control that supply of energy. So I think the hydrogen story, probably better than a battery. The sustainability story, I think, for a hydrogen system is better in that we're not mining valuable minerals and causing all sorts of political unrest around the world. So I'm quite optimistic, actually, that we'll have some form of hydrogen industry in Scotland in the fairly near future.
I think we'll just about wrap up there. Lastly, is there anything else, Ian, anything kind of exciting down the line that you see coming that you'd like to bring to our listeners' attention?
Well, one thing there which Robert touched on, was this kind of the balancing services, the flexibility services. This is something that is really kind of coming to the fore, and you are looking at some developers who are looking at sites, looking at a few kind of sites on farms that have been looked at where they're essentially building massive battery banks next to places that have a good grid connection. And the idea of that is to kind of add flexibility and add in this kind of demand management, kind of exactly what you said, like pump storage used to do, things like Cruick and Power Station. They would when there's suddenly a drop or a surge in demand on the network, they would kick in and help to meet that demand. So there is people now looking at batteries as a way to do that, as well as the kind of pump storage hydro stuff. So yeah, that and kind of all the kind of smart grid work, smart networks is quite an interesting time, which is helping to free up capacity and allowing quite a lot of new generation to come on to the grid. There's also quite a lot of policy stuff on the go, which is really interesting. We obviously have our net zero targets. COP27 is taking place in November. There's a few days which are focusing on, there's one day, I think 12th of November is focusing on agriculture, the 15th of November is focusing on energy, and they're looking at a whole bunch of really interesting stuff. So it's probably worthwhile checking out what they're saying, and if there's any kind of really good or clear kind of policy directions that come out of COP27.
I'm just thinking at the moment that we're at a time where farming, it's a scary time for anyone at the moment. There's a lot happening, not just for farmers across the whole country, across the whole world. There's a lot happening, but for me, I think at the moment, now's the time we will get through this as farmers. There is another side to this, and it is probably better than it was. What I think so exciting is that farming's relevant. Farming's now seen. We were properly in the spotlight for all the bad stuff, but we have a sense of purpose. I think again that we've got food to produce, energy to produce, land to use. Change is good, and I think there's really exciting things on the horizon for farmers, land managers, and young people to get into this sector as well. So I'm really pretty positive that, assuming that's going to be a difficult winter, but if we grit our teeth, the other side of this is better.
I think that's a good point to finish up on. Thanks, Ian and Robert, for joining. And if you'd like any more information on the topics that we covered, please visit the Farming for a Better Climate website. You'll also find some additional information on the Farm Advisory Service website. And as we mentioned, the Energy Agency and Home Energy Scotland and Business Energy Scotland are good places to look for more information. Thanks very much for listening.